If there's one thing worse than being forgotten by your family, it's being remembered for the wrong reasons. My name is Harper Owens, and for years I was the blank space in every family portrait, the invisible chair at every holiday table, the rumor that sat heavy in the air whenever the Owens name was mentioned. I was blamed, exiled, and dressed down in whispers after a wedding scandal that I didn't cause. A viral clip of my cousin Ivy's groom confessing to an affair with the maid of honor that someone else posted. And someone else decided I must have leaked because I knew how to edit a video. And because I had, in their tidy minds, always been the one who made noise. They didn't ask for proof. They didn't wait for facts. They just folded me into the story they'd been telling about me since childhood. Loud, unrefined, trouble. And at 25, my parents' voicemail box went silent and my mother stopped answering texts. My father called me an embarrassment to the family line, and the Owens reunions continued without me, their table lengthening with every omitted chair until the empty space where I should have been looked less like an absence and more like a sentence everyone agreed to end. I left Raleigh with a duffel bag and a heart full of stubbornness, moved to Asheville, started my own modest event planning business, learned to make other people's best days flawless while consigning my own to the margins, and swore that I would never again show up to beg for a place at the table that had already served me my last course. For years, I fed on small victories, a gleaming centerpiece here, a perfectly timed ribbon there, until one warm April morning when a cream-colored envelope with embossed lettering slipped through my mailbox and landed on my counter like a provocation. Ivy Owens and Nathaniel Brooks were getting married again, and the wedding invitation, addressed to Hannah Owens, had been misdelivered into my hands. At first I thought of the cruelest of jokes, then of the absurdity of it all. Ivy sending an invite to the cousin she'd helped exile, and yet the misaddressed envelope burned in my palm. A tiny blaze of possibility that made me imagine walking into the Glass Magnolia, that glossy hall of chandeliers and marble where wealthy people bought moments and sold images, and turning the polished air thin with a presence they'd sworn to forget. I could have walked away, slipped the card back into the mail slot and let the universe correct its mistake. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of red wine, scrolled through professional wedding portfolios until my laptop's glow reflected in my eyes, and let a dangerously precise idea take hold. If the Owens family worshipped appearances, if their currency was image, not truth, then I would spend everything I had of talent and taste to buy back my dignity in their terms. I would plan a wedding of my own, not for love, not even for marriage, but as a crafted spectacle that would make every Owens celebration look like a cheap rehearsal. A mock union so exquisite it would force them to look at me and, for once, be the ones left speechless. I drew up lists like a general. Venue, grand but not predictable. Theme, elegance with edges. Guest list, every Owens who had smiled while kicking me out, plus those who had whispered when my back was turned. Purpose, to make them remember my name as an act of creation rather than a scandal. The next day, I called Eli Turner, an old college friend and photographer who knew how to make staged things look real. "How believable can a fake engagement be if the pictures are perfect?" I asked, and he laughed into the phone because he knew me and because he loved a good scheme. The problem, of course, was the groom. I didn't have one. I had Landon Pierce, my former business partner, and the man who had once kissed me behind a supply tent after a summer wedding, a kiss we had both pretended did not happen because he had been engaged and because the world required us to be practical. And Landon answered my call with a skeptical, familiar drawl. "Harper Owens. Haven't heard that since you swore off family drama." I told him I needed a favor for a portfolio shoot, and he, who always had a soft spot for my stubborn competence, agreed to meet. I didn't tell him then that the portfolio was my life, only that I needed believable images of an engaged couple to pitch to a new client. As I planned, my anger softened at the edges, and something else, a cold, bright focus, took hold. If I could orchestrate every detail, invite every person, control the soundtrack and the speeches, I could shape the narrative that had been used against me. I could force a revelation that would make their gossip taste like ash. Even as the revenge idea hardened into a plan, I felt the natural tremors of fear, not of them, but of myself, of what streak of me would come out when I started pulling strings for the express purpose of humiliating others who had humiliated me. Still, the thought of sitting quietly and letting them assume the story they'd constructed remained true felt worse than any moral hazard. So I began methodically, contacting caterers who owed me favors, sketching florals that said luxury without screaming luxury, reserving the only weekend the Glass Magnolia had open, and jotting down names on a list that read like a who's who of the Owens roster. With each call, my heartbeat steadied and the plan's contours sharpened. Not just a wedding, but a performance with me at the center, resplendent and unashamed. I reminded myself that this wasn't about wrecking lives, it was about reclaiming mine, about showing the family whose version of me they had chosen to keep. And yet, as I penciled in toast ideas that would tilt towards revelation, and as I imagined the hush that would fall when a video, edited, of course, by someone with skill, played secrets in crystal clarity, I knew I stood at a dangerous seam between justice and spectacle. When Landon agreed to be photographed, and Eli promised to stage a convincing engagement shoot, I felt the momentum of an avalanche, inevitable and exhilarating. That night, I lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant cars on the street, whispering to myself a vow that sounded like both prayer and promise. They took my voice once. This time, I would make sure they could never pretend they hadn't heard me. The misdelivered invitation sat on my counter like a dare, and by the time the kettle whistled, I had sketched the first brittle bones of a plan so exacting it felt almost righteous. If the Owens clan measured worth in appearances, then I would weaponize mine, not with malice for malice's sake, but with choreography, light, and taste. So I called Eli to secure the photos that would sell the fiction, and Landon to ask, bluntly, whether he would pretend to be my fiancé for a little while, just long enough for the Owens' eyes to widen and for my name to stop being a whispered rumor. The calls felt clandestine and absurd, like plotting a small-scale revolution over coffee in someone else's kitchen. And yet when Landon's voice softened into that familiar mix of skepticism and something fond, he agreed on the condition we kept it tasteful, and that he had veto over anything that would publicly humiliate real people. A line I respected even as my purpose bent toward spectacle. And so we became conspirators in a deception that would require a cast of careful, loyal professionals. An editor who could make staged laughter look candid, a caterer who could pull last-minute favors without asking questions, a florist who could make silk roses appear to have been gathered at dawn, and a venue manager who still remembered me from a business meeting 3 years earlier and owed me a discount because I had saved his Christmas party from catastrophe. We created a cover story for the social posts, a pop-up portfolio shoot for a luxury bridal campaign, and wrote copy that sounded indistinguishable from the real thing, the sort of language people swallowed without thinking. Timeless love captured at the Glass Magnolia. Models, Harper and Landon. Invitations, RSVP lists, seating charts. I mapped them all like battle plans, writing names in my neat, small script and circling the Owens relatives I wanted in the room when the performance reached its peak. I ordered silk programs with gold foil type, and inside them a program that read like any earnest ceremony, though the vows were placeholders, and the music would be cued to keep emotion at the surface, where it could be observed and controlled. I told Eli to make the engagement photos so glossy that tabloids would have trouble telling them from a real announcement. He delighted in the challenge, hunting for light that would give Landon and me the ease of a couple who had been photographed together for years rather than weeks. We rehearsed smiles and practiced the small, easy touches that read as intimacy on camera. The way he would rest his hand at the small of my back as we walked, how I would tilt my chin when he whispered something private. The more I arranged, the more the edges of the plan smoothed into something dangerously beautiful, and I surprised myself by feeling a certain giddy pleasure at the logistics, negotiating linen colors, convincing a skeptical DJ to play a specific old song that would later cue a memory for one particular aunt, buying into the theater of the thing with more appetite than I had expected. Still, there was always the ache under the list-making, the knowledge that some guests would arrive with open hurts, that a few would hope for reconciliation and find instead that their seatmate was me, newly and deliberately radiant. I thought about my mother more than I let myself. She was a private person whose pride had been wounded deeper than most would admit, and I wondered how she would look at me if she ever saw the slideshow I was planning. Would she see a daughter reclaimed, or a spectacle she could not morally condone? At the edge of every tactical call and vendor negotiation flickered a smaller, quieter question about who I would be after the facade fell away. On one scouting trip to the Glass Magnolia, I bumped into Ivy, of all people, in the valet line, hair done in those precise waves that never showed a strand out of place, and for a breath, I considered abandoning the whole thing. She smiled when she saw me, that patient smile of somebody who kept an inventory of wrongs, and she asked, politely, if I'd seen the invitations. Was I coming? I lied with a practiced ease and said perhaps, that I might be around that weekend for work, then watched her turn away and felt the old familiar shiver of small-town judgment brush my skin. That evening, Landon and I sat on the back steps of my rental, the city a smudge of lights below, and he admitted that he was nervous about being the front of something that would hurt his friends who were real, which made me promise again that the goal was exposure of truth, not cruelty for its own sake. We tested the social proof, a staged engagement shoot posted on a private account, liked by a few local vendors, then slowly allowed to leak to mutual acquaintances. The traction was delicious. People began to comment with congratulatory emojis, and the Owens circle, with its reflexive habit of monitoring social airspace for any notice of each other, noticed. Invitations were printed and, under the guise of the campaign, mailed to a curated list. I sent separate, more personal notes to a few family members I wanted close. My cousin Maeve, who had once defended me in high school and who now ran an arts nonprofit, and Aunt Lorraine, whose sharp gossip often masked a surprising streak of loyalty, and asked them, honestly, to attend a friend's mock wedding that might serve as a fundraiser for a local shelter. The lies began to feel strategic rather than immoral. Each white lie had a thread that ran back to the wound the family had inflicted on me, and each small truth I let slip was a tether to the person I was trying to save. As weeks folded into secret meetings and flurries of text messages, I found an unexpected ally in my estranged father's old assistant, Marjorie, who still handled some of the family's domestic affairs and who resented the way the family had treated me. She fed me the little details that made family life legible: who drank too much at reunions, who had a temper thin as tissue, who had debts behind polite smiles. Details I could use not to destroy, but to expose patterns that needed daylight. There were nights I woke with adrenaline tasting metallic in my mouth, convinced I was about to make a mistake that could not be undone, and other nights when a reckless sort of joy settled into my bones because the plan was working. RSVP confirmations began to land, and a few of the Owens, including the cousin responsible for my exile, the same Ivy with her perfectly curated life, checked boxes that said accept. The logistics tightened. Parking for 100 cars, accommodations for out-of-town relatives, a running order where speeches would be spaced just so to allow a video montage to play at the precise point when the room's attention would be undivided. Yet even as I tightened timelines and approved floral sketches that looked like storms of white peonies and thistle blue delphinium, I navigated a private moral geography. I could not humiliate a person into ruin. I would reveal patterns, call out hypocrisies, and let the consequences fall where they may. But I swore I would not cross into cruelty that left collateral suffering in its wake. The rehearsals felt like prayer and preparation, and when Eli sent the first edited images of Landon and me, laughing in late light, fingers intertwined, I saw, with a clarity that made me both proud and a little sick, how convincing the lie could be if we fed it enough truth. And in that same instant, I knew there was no turning back. The envelope that once was a misdelivery was now a match in dry weather, and the evening when I would seat the Owens family in rows facing me had been set. The question that hummed in my chest was no longer whether I could do it, but what I would become when the hush broke and the room finally looked. I built the ceremony like a machine built to astonish, every seam invisible, every movement timed so the room would breathe together as if on cue. And I did it because I had learned that the Owens family only ever listened when the world around them was arranged to their liking. Chandeliers lowered 3 inches to catch the late light, a runner of moss and white peonies that looked casual and expensive, a program printed in the old family font so that the elders would approve before their jaws could form a question. And yet, beneath all that gloss, I was threading blades. The photographs Eli shot of Landon and me were warm, easy. I signed a press release that framed the weekend as a luxury bridal shoot for a new portfolio, which explained why photographers, caterers, and a rarefied florist were all willing to bend their rules, and why invitations that could pass for real were mailed to the Owens list without raising eyebrows. Landon wore a suit that made his shoulders broad and his face readable on camera, and he walked through the fabrication with the steadiness that calmed me more than any vendor contract. Sometimes, watching him smile on command, I almost convinced myself the fantasy might become true if I let it, but then I remembered why I was lighting this fire in the first place. We scheduled a rehearsal dinner for Friday under the pretense of a creative dinner for collaborators, and I curated the guest list so that the Owens members I most wanted together, Ivy, her husband, my estranged uncle who managed the family trust, and my father's old circle of friends would sit on the same side of the table. I seated the evening with small, artful provocations, a toast by Maeve that praised honesty that cost more than comfort, a video montage of my life that began innocuously with childhood photos and moved, cinematically and without comment, to a single clip of Ivy's first wedding night. Not the scandalous angle, but tightly edited frames that, when juxtaposed with later images of hushed grocery store exchanges and late-night receipts, suggested inconsistency and left the imagination to fill the rest. I had thought I would be content to show them a spectacle of my own success, but as the weeks passed, I found the plan widening into something I hadn't allowed for: investigation. Marjorie, my father's assistant, became a secret repository of small truths, boxes of receipts that proved certain lavish lifestyles were funded not by inheritance, but by loans, and in one ledger a pattern of transfers that smelled like embezzlement if you read them with the right light. Aunt Lorraine, who had once told me I had no right to mouth off at family affairs, admitted over coffee that she'd always suspected someone was taking advantage of Ivy's name for years, and that the family's public composure was thin as tissue. I hired a young paralegal friend of Maeve's to run queries and cross-reference property records, not because I wanted to press charges or drag people into court, but because I wanted the evidence to be irrefutable when the time came. A montage that hinted at infidelity is theater. A timeline coupled with redacted documents read like proof. There were nights when the moral weight of that research sat on me like wet wool. Was I becoming the kind of person who used truth as a weapon rather than a salve? But Landon, who had watched me scale the plan from a petty dream to an all-consuming enterprise, reminded me that exposing a pattern of theft or hypocrisy could save others who were not me. He was careful to say it gently, to remind me that design without empathy becomes cruelty. And I listened, because he had always been the person who kept me tethered to nuance when my inclinations were more gladiatorial. Rehearsals felt almost holy. We practiced walking down the aisle until the way I bent my wrist read like a signature, until the way Landon looked at me in the staged photos registered as genuine affection to anyone skimming social feeds. I wrote toast notes I didn't intend to read, just to hear how they sounded aloud, and I rehearsed my face for when the room fell into that rare hush where speeches become verdicts. Eli delivered draft edits of the video montage that made my stomach drop with their precision, intercut interviews with quiet family friends, a shot of a ledger under a lamp, a recorded voicemail from a woman who'd been quietly double-billed for catering at a family charity event. Each piece placed like a small, bright stone in a path that led toward the one moment I had imagined since the misdelivered invitation, the heartbeat when everyone would look up and, for the first time in years, see me. I also cultivated allies outside of the spectacle. Maeve agreed to sit in the front row and, if I needed it, to speak plainly about patterns she'd observed in philanthropic funds and in Ivy's sudden cash influxes, while Aunt Lorraine, whose gossip had previously been a weapon against me, promised to be the sort of relative who asked hard questions in public. Their support felt less like conspiracy and more like reclamation. People who remembered me as Harper, not as the rumor. And there were practicalities to manage that no one ever tells you about. Parking attendants briefed not to allow certain family members to leave early. A subtle cue agreed with the DJ to pause music when the montage began, so every phone would be put away and every eye would focus on the screen. Through it all, I kept a private ledger of my own. Reasons for doing this that were more complicated than revenge. I wanted my mother to see that I had not been a pariah without cause, that I could build beauty out of ruin, that the chair that had been left empty in every Owens photo could be a throne of sorts, if I chose to sit in it gracefully. And yet I admitted to myself, rarely, quietly, that the idea of hearing them scramble, of watching the family narrative crack like glass, provided a fierce pleasure I had not anticipated. One afternoon, while confirming floral arrangements, I found myself laughing in a vendor's loading bay at the absurdity of how meticulously we were staging a lie. Landon, standing with me among crates of roses, brushed a petal off my sleeve and said simply, "Do it the right way, Harper. Hurt the lie, not the people who don't deserve it." I promised him I would. Then, as the week of the event approached and RSVPs stacked in my inbox like a threatening geometry, I sat alone in my apartment and rehearsed not the speeches, but the silence that would follow them. That exact second when the room would have to reckon with what it had accepted as truth for so long. The plan was no longer merely about spectacle or revenge. It had mutated into a reckoning I hoped might be redemptive for more than just me. And when I finally, at 3 a.m, pinned the last RSVP to the corkboard, Ivy, Nathaniel, Uncle Henry, my father marked as maybe, I felt a tide shift under my feet and understood that the wedding I had designed could either break everything I loved or set the world back to rights. There was no turning back now, only the careful choreography of a day that would demand honesty dressed in silk. The days leading up to the wedding unfolded with the manic stillness of a storm gathering its shape. Every ribbon, every song, every name on the seating chart pulsed with hidden intent, and I moved through it all with the precision of someone balancing on the edge of her own creation, knowing that one tremor could turn the entire performance into ruin. Still, there was a strange, almost tender satisfaction in the details, in watching chaos submit to my control, because for years I had been the narrative they wrote about, the one who couldn't be trusted with family matters. And now I was writing the story line by line in florals and lighting cues, staging my revenge in white silk and gold foil while pretending it was just another event. I'd convinced myself that the hardest part was logistics, until the secrets began to surface, unbidden, raw, and shimmering like oil beneath calm water. Because once you start peeling the polite layer off a family built on appearances, you don't find one rot, you find many.
It started when Marjorie sent me a flash drive labeled simply, "You should know." Inside were scanned letters and accounting ledgers for my uncle's charitable foundation, numbers that didn't add up, signatures forged to funnel donations into private accounts that funded Ivy's lifestyle, her business trips, her boutique that had never made a profit. I stared at those PDFs under the soft hum of my desk lamp and felt the floor tilt, not because the corruption shocked me, but because it didn't. The next day, Aunt Lorraine, trembling with the righteousness of gossip that finally found a moral spine, confessed that Ivy had known the truth of her first husband's affair long before the scandal broke, and had orchestrated the confrontation to happen on camera, turning humiliation into publicity. My supposed betrayal had been her performance all along, and I had been exiled to make her look clean. The knowledge didn't satisfy me the way I'd imagined it would. It filled me with a cold, eerie pity and a sharper determination to expose what the Owens name had come to mean, a dynasty built on deceit and curated smiles. I didn't tell anyone right away, not even Landon, though he sensed it in the way I started rewriting the video sequence, inserting fragments of audio from the financial documents over slow fades of family portraits. When he asked if I was sure, I said, "If they built their name on lies, then truth is mercy," though I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. That night, after everyone left the rehearsal dinner tasting, he stayed behind to help me pack the leftover wine, and under the low glow of string lights, he said, "You're building something extraordinary, Harper, but make sure you're not burning down the only bridge you might ever want to cross again." I didn't answer because part of me wanted the bridge gone, part of me wanted the ashes. Still, I softened my plan. I wouldn't humiliate individuals, I would expose the pattern, a generational rot that needed disinfecting daylight. The next morning, Maeve called to say she'd uncovered something worse. Our grandfather's estate funds had been quietly liquidated years before his death, funneled through shell accounts into real estate registered under Ivy's husband's company. The Owens fortune, the myth that bound everyone's pride, was smoke. I watched the evidence unfold like scripture, each transaction a verse in the gospel of hypocrisy. And I thought of my mother, who had once told me, "We don't tell truth to hurt, we tell it to heal," and wondered what she'd think if she knew what I was planning to unveil in a ballroom lined with white roses and borrowed grace. Landon sensed my withdrawal in the days before the wedding, the way I moved through rehearsals like a ghost, smiling on cue that keeping my eyes elsewhere. He tried to joke about it, then grew quiet, then one evening showed up at my apartment with takeout and a bottle of cheap bourbon, saying only, "If you're going to bring down an empire, at least eat something first." We sat cross-legged on the floor, sifting through vendor checklists and the evidence files in alternating piles. And at some point I realized his hand had stayed near mine for too long to be accidental. I wanted to pull away, but his touch felt like an anchor, and I was so tired of drifting. He kissed me, slow, careful, as though asking permission not just for that moment, but for all the unspoken ones ahead. And I let him, not because I believed in love then, but because it felt like forgiveness in physical form. The morning after, I woke before dawn, guilt and clarity braided together in my chest. I wrote my speech, not a toast, but a reckoning, drafting it on the back of a floral invoice because it seemed fitting to build truth on the bones of decoration. The opening line was simple. Every family has a story. This one has a ledger. I rehearsed it aloud, imagining their faces, the gasps and stifled mutters, the dawning recognition that the outcast they had mocked was standing taller than the lie they'd lived in. And for a fleeting moment I felt power, pure and clean like oxygen. But with every word I memorized, something else hollowed out inside me. What would victory even look like once they were stripped bare? Would I walk out of that ballroom lighter or lonelier? On the final night before the event, I went to the Glass Magnolia alone to finalize the lighting cues. The place was silent except for the distant hum of air vents, the chandeliers like frozen galaxies above me. I stood where the altar would be and whispered the names of everyone who had once told me I wasn't enough, each name dissolving into the vaulted air until the echoes sounded less like accusation and more like release. I told myself I wasn't doing this for vengeance, but for truth. But deep down I knew truth without compassion could cut as cruelly as any lie. Still, the train was moving, the guests confirmed, the caterers booked, the florist en route, and I had become both passenger and conductor on a ride I no longer knew how to stop. When I left that night, I locked the venue myself, the key warm in my palm, and for the first time since the misdelivered invitation arrived, I cried. Not because of what they did to me, but because I wasn't sure who I would be once they finally saw what I'd done in return. The next morning, Landon found me sitting outside the venue steps, a coffee cooling beside me, and said softly, "You don't have to go through with it." I looked up at him and smiled the way you do when you know the ending's already written, even if you haven't turned the last page, and said, "It's already begun."
The morning of the wedding broke over North Carolina like a secret the sun couldn't wait to tell, golden and trembling, and by 7 a.m., the Glass Magnolia was already alive with the murmurs of florists and caterers, each person unknowingly threading their own rhythm into the choreography of my reckoning. I moved among them calm and precise, my clipboard steady even though my pulse wasn't, and when I caught my reflection in one of the tall, gilded mirrors, white silk gown fitted to perfection, hair pinned like I was marrying a future instead of exercising a past, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked like a bride, but because she looked untouchable. Guests began arriving just after noon, the Owens clan stepping out of rented SUVs and polished sedans like royalty resurrected for a portrait. And as each familiar face crossed the marble threshold, Aunt Lorraine in lavender, Uncle Henry with his smug grin, my father looking older and more breakable than memory allowed, I felt the temperature of the room shift, a hum beneath the string quartet that wasn't music but anticipation. They thought this was real, thought I had found someone willing to love me despite the stains on my family record, and part of me wanted to scream the truth before the hour struck, but the larger, colder part, the part that had been starved for recognition for years, wanted them to see the show first. Landon, steady and devastating in his charcoal suit, took my hand as we lined up for the processional. His palm was warm, grounding, and he whispered, "Whatever happens, don't let them steal this moment." And I nodded, not trusting myself to speak because in that heartbeat, standing in the doorway with the music swelling, it hit me that even if everything ended in chaos, I had already taken back the narrative. The ceremony itself unfurled like clockwork, Eli's cameras capturing every glance, every breath. My mother sat rigid in the second row, eyes glistening with the confusion of a woman trying to reconcile her estranged daughter with the spectacle before her. And I wanted to reach for her, but timing was everything. The officiant, a friend of Maeve's posing for authenticity, spoke of love as the truest form of courage, and I wondered if truth itself counted. Landon repeated his mock vows with such quiet conviction that a few guests actually cried, and when it was my turn, I hesitated just long enough to feel the room hold its breath. "Families," I began, voice soft but amplified by the hidden microphones Eli had insisted on, "are built on stories. Some true, some told so often they start to sound like truth." There was a stir, a ripple of uneasy awareness as I continued, weaving what began as a thank you into something far sharper. I spoke about legacy, about lies dressed as loyalty, about how appearances could imprison even the most faithful hearts. And when I looked up, Ivy's smile had frozen into porcelain. The first chords of the reception music began before anyone could fully process the shift, and as waiters began to circulate with champagne, I gave Eli the signal. The lights dimmed, the music softened, and the giant projector screen that had been framed as a tribute montage flickered to life. It began innocently. Childhood photos of me and my cousins at the lake, my parents dancing in sepia tones, but soon the images changed. Spreadsheets overlaying smiling faces, headlines that didn't exist yet but would, snippets of audio, voices whispering about funds moved and no one will notice, intercut with the Owens family crest. Gasps fractured the air like breaking glass. The final frame froze on Ivy and her husband holding a ribbon-cutting check for the Owens Foundation, the amount bold and damning beneath the watermark of a forged signature. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. No forks, no whispers, only the weight of collective recognition. Then the murmurs started, soft and horrified, growing into a roar. My father rose first, pale and shaking, his voice strangled with disbelief as he said my name like a prayer and a curse all at once. Ivy stood, tried to laugh it off as some kind of sick prank, but the auditors Maeve had quietly invited were already in motion, faces grim, notebooks open. I didn't have to say a word. Truth was louder than any speech I could have written. Cameras flashed, guests whispered, and the Owens dynasty cracked before my eyes, its marble facade crumbling into dust in a single afternoon. Somewhere between the noise and the panic, my mother came to me, trembling, and touched my cheek. No words, just tears that carried both sorrow and relief, and in that moment, I realized that revenge had given me something deeper than victory. Witness. I hadn't silenced them with scandal, I had silenced them with proof. The chaos unfolded like theater. Ivy's husband stormed out, reporters began calling before dessert was served, and I stood there amid the wreckage of white petals and champagne bubbles, oddly serene, as though I knew this would happen down to the minute. Landon found me in the garden afterward, where the magnolia trees caught the late light and the noise from inside softened into a dull hum. He did it, he said, voice equal parts awe and sadness, and I shook my head because what I had done didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a necessary ending. No, I said quietly, I just stopped pretending. He smiled then, tired and proud, and for the first time I saw what all this meant beyond vengeance. I had rewritten my place in the story, not as the villain they invented, but as the author. As the sun dipped low and guests began to scatter, I walked back into the empty hall where petals lay crushed underfoot, and the screen still flickered faintly with the Owens crest. I took off my heels, let the cold marble steady me, and whispered into the silence, "It's over." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. Not entirely. The fallout would echo, the press would swarm, the family name would rebuild or break, but none of that mattered. For the first time in years, I felt whole, unhidden. I turned to find Landon watching me, the faintest smile on his face, and when he asked, "So what now?" I simply said, "Now, I live my own story." And as the final light slid across the glass walls of the magnolia, gilding the wreckage like redemption, I understood that the true silence wasn't theirs, it was mine. The kind that comes when you've said everything you needed to say and finally have nothing left to prove. The silence that followed the wedding was not immediate but slow, a kind of echo that lingered in every newspaper headline and hushed conversation across Carolina, spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. And I, Harper Owens, watched it all unfold from the porch of my small Asheville home, where the magnolia blooms had just started to brown at their edges, fragile and fragrant reminders of the day I burned the Owens legend to the ground. In the weeks that came, the fallout was both spectacular and strangely quiet. Family members resigned from boards, the Owens Foundation was audited, Ivy and her husband vanished on an extended trip to Europe that reporters quickly discovered was an escape route funded by the very accounts I had exposed. And my father, always the emblem of stoic respectability, issued a statement that read like contrition but sounded more like self-preservation. For a while, my name filled the local papers. Outcast event planner uncovers family fraud at own wedding. A headline so surreal it made me laugh and cry in the same breath. Strangers treated me like a folk hero, a symbol of rebellion dressed in lace, while those who had once shared my last name treated me like a ghost, acknowledged but never spoken to directly. The phone rang constantly those first few days, reporters and former clients wanting a quote, a comment, a confession, but I said nothing. I had already said enough in the only language the Owens family understood: spectacle. Landon stayed with me through the storm, sleeping on my couch when the media vans parked outside, bringing coffee and silence in equal measure, his steady presence a reminder that I had not just destroyed something, but perhaps begun to build something new, fragile as it was. We spent long nights talking about what came next. His business had doubled thanks to the exposure. Mine was a paradox of fame and infamy. But when I asked him if he regretted helping me, he only said, "You told the truth, Harper. It's the rest of them who have to learn how to live with it." Still, there were moments when I woke in the small hours haunted not by guilt, but by the strange emptiness that comes after fulfillment,
when the thing you've chased for years finally collapses into your hands, and you realize revenge doesn't fill the space it carved out. I missed my mother most then. After the wedding, she had sent me a letter. No return address, no signature, just a single sentence in her looping script. Sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to expose it to air. I carried that letter in my wallet like a talisman, reading it when doubt began to whisper that I'd gone too far. Time, that quiet surgeon, began to suture the wounds I'd opened. By autumn, the Owens name had become synonymous with scandal, but the people who bore it were learning humility the way I had learned solitude, painfully, one day at a time. Ivy eventually returned to the States, her empire dissolved, her face drawn and unfamiliar on the cover of tabloids. I didn't rejoice when I saw her like that, though I'd imagined I would. I just felt a hollow compassion, the kind that recognizes ruin because it's worn it too. My father, perhaps the proudest of them all, called me 6 months later. His voice was smaller, older, and he said, "You were right to do what you did, but I wish you'd told me first." And I said, "You never would have listened." And he sighed, because we both knew it was true. That was the closest we ever came to forgiveness. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my business quietly, rebranding under my own name instead of hiding behind company titles. And to my surprise, clients came. Brides who admired my fearlessness. Couples who said they wanted their weddings to mean something real, not just a performance. I found a new purpose in crafting moments of truth for others, small and honest, the opposite of the spectacle I had once created to make a point. Landon became my partner in more than business, though we never called it love in the beginning. It was companionship born of shared survival, laughter that came from the same ache, and late nights spent designing futures that didn't need revenge as fuel. Sometimes we'd drive past the glass magnolia on our way to events, and I'd watch the sunlight hit those glass walls and think of the girl I was standing under those chandeliers, how she needed to prove herself loud enough to silence a lifetime of dismissal. And I would feel both proud and tender toward her, grateful she had the courage to end one story so another could begin. The world, predictably, moved on. New scandals rose, the Owens family faded from headlines, and one day a magazine reached out to do a "Where Are They Now?" feature, calling me the woman who turned her family shame into strength. I declined the interview. Strength, I'd learned, didn't need an audience. It lived quietly in mornings spent arranging flowers for someone else's joy, in the steady hum of work done without the need for applause, in the soft laughter that replaced bitterness. A year after the wedding that wasn't, I hosted a small gathering at my home, nothing extravagant, just a few friends, some wine, the smell of rain in the garden, and for the first time in nearly a decade, my mother walked through the door. She looked uncertain, older, carrying the weight of years we'd lost, and I didn't say anything, just opened my arms. She stayed the night, slept in my guest room, and when I woke in the morning, I heard her humming in the kitchen. The tune so familiar it made my throat ache. Over breakfast, she said, "You did what none of us could, Harper. You told the truth." And I realized she wasn't talking about the fraud or the scandal. She meant the truth of who we were beneath the Owens shine. In the months that followed, life became beautifully ordinary. I planted herbs, learned to bake, said yes when Landon asked me not to marry him, but to build something together that wasn't built on spectacle, but trust. We never had a wedding. We didn't need one. Sometimes, though, when the air was heavy with summer heat and the magnolia trees bloomed again, I'd drive to Lake Norman, to the spot where the glass magnolias stood, and sit in my car watching new brides pose for photos on those same marble steps, all radiant hope and nervous joy. I never envied them. I only wished for them what I had finally found, peace, born not from perfection, but from honesty. And as I drive away, the road stretching gold in the rearview mirror, I would think of the girl who once thought she needed revenge to be seen. And I'd whisper to her, "You were already enough." That was the real silence that followed the storm. Not absence, but calm. The kind that hums through your bones when the noise finally fades and you realize you don't have to fight to be heard anymore. I wasn't the black sheep anymore. I wasn't the scandal or the savior. I was simply Harper Owens. whole, unhidden, and finally free.